crime. It's a pretty slimy tactic to use the word insurrection over and over and over and over and over again, and yet try to hide the fact that the gentleman who's sitting here before us today, who was responsible for prosecuting many of the people on January 6th, never once charged anybody with violating 18 U.S.C. section 2383. You never charged anybody with violating that statute. You never convicted anybody with violating that statute. So sitting here and using that word over and over again means absolutely nothing.
This may look like a dispute over words, but it's actually a test of how power defines reality. What's really being tested here is whether legal standards or political narratives guide accountability in moments of national crisis. This raises broader questions about how institutions choose which facts to pursue and which to ignore when public trust is already fragile. In this video, we'll break down how investigative focus, security decisions, and narrative framing intersect, and why those choices matter for democratic oversight.
As a gentlelady from Wyoming.
The ranking member indicated that the first lesson that you teach lawyers is you better bring the evidence with you. But another lesson that we learn is that you should also know the elements of the crime and the relevant statute if you're going to claim that somebody committed a crime. It's a pretty slimy tactic to use the word insurrection over and over and over and over and over again, and yet try to hide the fact that the gentleman who's sitting here before us today, who was responsible for prosecuting many of the people on January 6th, never once charged anybody with violating 18 U.S.C. section 2383. You never charged anybody with violating that statute. You never convicted anybody with violating that statute. So sitting here and using that word over and over again means absolutely nothing. We are here today focusing on the pipe bomb because of what happened that day. It clearly played a pivotal role in facilitating the breach of the Capitol, and we need to get to the bottom of what happened there. These devices were discovered outside the RNC and DNC within 20 minutes of the joint session, and the U.S. Capitol Police were forced to defy the forces while a crowd of protesters moved towards the Capitol. The U.S. Capitol Police was not dealing with just the force division, but also with the fact that 500 bike racks had been removed the night before. Who ordered the removal of the 500 bike racks and why? The staff of the architect of the Capitol testified that the evening of January 5th, roughly around the time the pipe bombs were allegedly planted, the order came down to remove 500 bike racks from around the Capitol. Mr. Pajota, can bike racks help law enforcement with crowd control and deterrence?
Absolutely. They form a physical barrier between the crowd and a protected location, or they can be used to help funnel a crowd to or from a location.
Well, can they also serve as a visual cue for non-law enforcement personnel about what lines they are not allowed to cross? And could removing them spell legal jeopardy for protesters who cannot identify what is the line of trespass?
It creates ambiguity for the public. They don't know where those barriers are.
And did this actually result in legal jeopardy for many of the people who were on the Capitol grounds on January 6th?
It ended up that way.
Okay. According to the Select January 6th Committee's final report, quote, at 1:28 p.m., the U.S. Capitol Police requested the AOC to deliver 400 additional bike racks to the East Front to serve as protective barriers, even though rioters were using bike racks as weapons. The pipe bomb discovery at the DNC prevented the AOC from delivering them, end quote. Clearly, the Capitol Police viewed the bike racks as a necessary tool for that day, and their removal is absolutely baffling. And this subcommittee should focus on identifying who gave that order, why, when, who was involved. We need to get to the bottom of this. And the previous January 6th committee didn't look into it. They're not the ones who actually investigated what happened here and why. This statement is also clear that the impacts of the pipe bombs continue to be felt by the U.S. Capitol Police officers responding to the incident. And Mr. Pajota, does this raise even more questions about why the Ray FBI did not take this pipe bomb investigation seriously?
The Ray FBI did not prioritize this investigation. Again, I think their resources and their attention was split into the other events of January 6th. And over time, what we saw was I would say, a weak or inept case management approach where this investigation eventually stalled.
Okay. Mr. Especial, do you have anything that you would like to briefly add to the discussion today?
I think that probably the biggest takeaway in all of this is that there are 1,600 American citizens that were baited into a trespass trap to a great extent. Yes, certainly, absolutely, some of them were violent, and investigations and prosecutions were warranted. But I have an estimate that it was almost $1 billion that was spent on prosecuting American citizens. It's a lot of money that we spent on trying to prosecute patriotic American citizens, and then you add on top of that the thousands of American citizens that, like myself, that were also weaponized against in order for deterrence purposes, all the tactical resources. It was really a terror campaign. I would refer you to the National Counterterrorism reports available on my website, and it's highlighted where they want an FBI domestic terrorism statute, quote, for deterrence purposes. They want to be able to silence free speech. They did that with all of this. And, the cause, bottom line is 51 intelligence officers memo, Hunter Biden laptop. It's all these things where the American citizens that showed up that day were at their wits' end on having faith in their government. And they were vulnerable. As I warned, they were vulnerable.
Well, and I think Hunter Biden is a good name to bring forward when you talk to with Mr. Romano here when we talk about the appropriateness of pardons. Mr. Nance, do you have anything to very briefly add?
I think one of the biggest things that the American people need to take away from this is the understanding that how dangerous narrative-led investigations can be. Because I think what we have going on here in large measure are narratives driven by the Biden White House through the Garland DOJ, and these are, of course, communications happening, headquarters to headquarters. And Director Wray, as any leader can present the commander's intent without explicitly doing so. So if he's getting communications from his boss, who is the Attorney General, that the narrative needs to be, we need to prioritize and stick with the J6 insurrection narrative, the pipe bomber narrative, or the pipe bomber investigation, in my opinion, was deprioritized because of that narrative coming from potentially the White House.
Well, I appreciate your testimony. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being willing to expose this. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from
Just moments ago, the hearing arrived at a moment that felt almost understated, yet profoundly revealing. A simple question was asked calmly and deliberately. Who ordered the removal of 500 bike racks from the Capitol complex the night before, January 6th, and why? There was no dramatic flourish, no raised voice, only silence, hesitation, and answers that drifted without settling. In that pause, something essential was exposed, not only about that day, but about how power operates when clarity becomes inconvenient. What unfolded was not merely a debate over equipment or logistics. It was a confrontation with the architecture of responsibility itself. Because those bike racks were not decoration. They were physical boundaries. They signaled where citizens could stand and where they could not. They guided movement, reduced confusion, and created lawful order. When they vanished quietly, without a transparent explanation, they left behind ambiguity. And ambiguity in moments of tension becomes consequence. The testimony made clear that those barriers served a vital role in crowd management and public understanding. They were visual cues, they were lines that mattered. And when they were removed, ordinary people were left to navigate a space where the rules were suddenly unclear. The line between lawful presence and violation blurred. Not by accident, but by omission. In a nation governed by law, that distinction is everything. What followed only deepened the unease. We heard that law enforcement later requested hundreds of additional bike racks to restore order. That request was never fulfilled. Not because the need disappeared, but because attention had shifted elsewhere. Resources were divided, priorities were reassigned, and the investigation into the unexplained devices discovered nearby stalled, losing momentum as time passed and focus narrowed. This is where the story moves beyond one hearing room and into the heart of American governance. Because justice is not only about what is prosecuted, it is about what is pursued. It is about what questions are allowed to remain unanswered and which narratives are allowed to dominate. We were reminded that despite repeated rhetoric, no one was charged under the specific statute so often invoked in public discourse. Words were used, labels repeated, but the legal threshold was never crossed. And in a system that claims to honor evidence and statute, that contradiction matters. The witnesses spoke of investigations shaped not solely by facts, but by predetermined conclusions, of narratives driving process instead of process guiding truth. When law enforcement becomes reactive to political expectations, when emphasis flows from leadership intent rather than objective inquiry, justice loses its anchor. It becomes directional, selective, fragile. What we saw today was not an argument about history. It was a warning about precedent. When physical safeguards are removed without explanation, when investigations slow without accountability, when language replaces law, and when clarity gives way to convenience, trust erodes. Not all at once, but steadily, quietly, until citizens no longer know where the lines are or whether those lines are meant to be seen at all. This hearing revealed something deeply unsettling, that thousands of Americans may have found themselves caught in a system that punished ambiguity while creating it. That enormous sums were spent pursuing prosecutions, while foundational questions about preparation, prevention, and responsibility remained unanswered. And that those questions were not ignored by accident, but deferred by choice. Government power carries with it an obligation to be precise, restrained, and transparent. When it is not, the damage is not theoretical. It is real. It is lasting. It reshapes how citizens relate to their institutions and whether they believe those institutions exist to serve truth or enforce narrative. The question of who ordered the removal of those bike racks is no longer just logistical. It is moral, because behind it lies a deeper question. Who decides when safeguards are removed, when clarity is sacrificed, and when accountability stops? In the end, this hearing did not offer closure. It offered illumination. It showed us how easily responsibility can dissolve into bureaucracy, how easily facts can be overshadowed by storyline, and how easily justice can lose its footing when power is no longer required to explain itself. A republic survives not on slogans, but on answers, on evidence, on transparency, and on the courage to ask uncomfortable questions, even when the answers disrupt the approved version of events. If you believe those questions still deserve answers, support our work to expose the truth. Subscribe to Liberty Report USA.